Okay, welcome to the section 1 of our project stakeholder management. And this is the first process in the stakeholder management knowledge area. In this section, we're going to be discussing the identify stakeholders process. All right, so it's the first process in the knowledge area, and it is the beginning phase of your management of the stakeholders of your project. All right, so without further ado, let's jump into the meat of the matter. All right, firstly, an overview of the identify stakeholder process. Identifying stakeholders is the initial step in stakeholder management, and it is aimed at recognizing all individuals, groups, or organizations that may be impacted by or have an impact on the project. Alright, so like we've established before, the stakeholders could be individuals. Alright, individuals could be customers, they could be suppliers, it could be groups, alright, groups of people, it could be organizations, alright, but the common thing among all of them is that they have some form of impact on the project's outcome, and they also can be impacted by the project activities as well as the project outcome itself. All right. Stakeholder identification involves systematically identifying and documenting stakeholders' interests, expectations, roles, and potential influence on the project. All right, so when we're talking about identifying stakeholders, it's all about getting to know what interests do they have on the project, what do they expect from this project, what's their role in the project execution, all right, or the project life cycle, and what influence do they have on the project. So at the end of this section, you should be able to understand the purpose and importance of the identify stakeholders process. You should also be able to identify the inputs, the tools and techniques, as well as the output of this process. And you'll also learn how to systematically identify and document stakeholders' interests, expectations, roles, and potential influence on your projects. Okay, so let's move on. Now, what are the objectives of this process? Identify stakeholders. The first objective is to recognize the stakeholders. All right, identify all internal and external entities that may affect or be affected by the project. So this is a critical thing to note. The stakeholders could be internal, all right, they could be within the project, all right, the project team. The project team members are in fact, they are the first stakeholders in the project. All right, they could be members of the project team. They could also be employees or executives within the project organization. All right, the CEO, the managers, the heads of departments. All right, these are also stakeholders. All right, so depending on what level you're looking at this, the project team itself is a nuclear team. All right, so any team external to that could be anybody outside of that could be referred to as external. Anybody inside that could be referred to as internal. All right, and then you talk about the project organization. Okay, so when you're looking at the project organization and also the outside world, you could also say people within the project organization are internal, and then people outside of the project organizations are external. All right, or you could take it the other way. So depending on what level, all right, of entity you are looking at. So then we know that it's important to know that recognizing the stakeholders is identifying all the entities, whether they're internal or external, irrespective of the level at which you are looking at it. Understand stakeholders' interests and expectations. So at this point, you gather information about stakeholders' needs, concerns, and desired project outcomes. So what are their needs and what are their concerns? What do they desire from this project? Determine stakeholders' roles and influence. So here you assess stakeholders' level of involvement, authority, and ability to influence project decisions and outcomes. Okay. Last but not the least, establish a basis for stakeholder engagement. Now here you're going to lay the foundation for developing communication strategies, engagement plans, and relationship management approaches tailored to stakeholders' characteristics and requirements. Now this is important. For each of the stakeholders that you identify, you have to also note what characteristics they have. Right? What are their characteristics? Okay, first and foremost, in terms of you can classify these characteristics using various criteria. Okay, it could be based on demography. All right, in terms of demography, we'll talk about their geographical location, we'll talk about their gender, we'll talk about their age bracket, all right, and maybe level of education or literacy. Do you understand? So you could group them based on that, and then you could also group them based on psychography. All right, the way they think, the phase of life in which they are, whether they are single or married, you know, factors like that. And then also you could categorize them based on firmography. If you're dealing with organizations now, all right, you could categorize them based on the number of employees, the industry they are in, and so on and so forth. All right, so you have to understand the characteristics of these various stakeholders, and then their requirements. All right, so these are the objectives of the identify stakeholder process. All right, recognize the stakeholders, you understand their interests, you determine their roles and their influence, and then you establish the basis for engaging them in your project. All right. Alright, so let's begin to look at the inputs in this process. First is the project charter. Now, the project charter provides an initial list of stakeholders and their roles. So from the project charter, you're going to get a list of all your stakeholders. I mean, we've already talked about the project charter before, so it contains all the stakeholders that you have for the particular project. All right, when preparing your project charter, you must have done your stakeholder identification and then captured them in the project charter. So that's why it comes as an input here when you're now dealing with this particular knowledge area. Organizational assets: historical stakeholder register, organizational charts, and stakeholder analysis templates. Okay, so these will also come as input here, all right, for you to be able to identify the stakeholders that you're dealing with in this project. Enterprise environmental factors: so these are industry regulations, cultural norms, and stakeholder engagement policies. So those also will come as inputs in identifying your stakeholders. Okay, also we have stakeholder registers updates. Right, previous stakeholder assessment, feedback, and changes in project scope or objectives. So you're gonna have this as an input as well. Okay, alright, so now let's look at the tools and techniques that we can now use in identifying the stakeholders, having learned the inputs. Firstly, we have stakeholder analysis. Alright, this is a systematic process for identifying stakeholders, assessing their interests, influence, and potential impact on the project. So it's a process, all right, a systematic process of an analysis, or getting to identify the stakeholders. Stakeholder mapping. This is a visual representation of stakeholders' relationships, interest, and influence level. So you do stakeholder mapping. You have to do a visual representation of their relationships. All right, so most of these things we have templates for them. Okay, so if you visit the templates section in the training platform, you can find some of the templates that you can use to do all this. Okay, and next, expert judgment. Input from subject matter experts and stakeholders with relevant knowledge and experience. All right, so of course this is a given. You must have it handy, all right, when identifying your stakeholders. Also, stakeholder registers. Documentation of identified stakeholders, their attributes, and relevant information. So I've already talked about how you could, characterize stakeholders based upon various factors like demography, psychography, firmography, right, depending on those stakeholders. Now, when you have identified them and you've characterized them like that, it will also help in your analysis. All right, will also facilitate the analytical process of your stakeholders. Okay, so those are the tools and techniques that you use for identifying stakeholders. All right, so what are the outputs from this process? Now, first is the stakeholder register. So after you've identified them, and then of course you're using those tools and techniques, you now have the outputs, which the major one is the stakeholder register. It is a comprehensive list of identified stakeholders, their roles, responsibilities, interests, and contact information. Very important. Remember, you're going to be communicating with these stakeholders throughout the life cycle of the project. So if you're going to do that, you need to have their contact information, their details, their data. Okay, so that's it. Then stakeholder analysis. This is a documentation of stakeholder interests, influence, and attitudes, as well as potential impact on the project. Okay, stakeholder engagement plan updates. These are initial strategies for engaging stakeholders and managing their expectations. So with all the data you've gathered about your stakeholders, you will now come up with an engagement plan, right, called a stakeholder engagement plan. And this plan encapsulates the initial strategies you use for engaging and managing your stakeholder expectation throughout, and it might also aid you throughout the project life cycle. Let's move on. All right, so what are the key takeaways from this process, the identify stakeholder process? Firstly, stakeholder identification is a critical step in stakeholder management. It lays the groundwork for effective communication, engagement, and relationship management. All right, so it's very, very critical, the first step, if you're going to get it right. Okay, stakeholders include individuals, groups, or organizations with vested interest in the project's success, such as sponsors, customers, team members, suppliers, regulatory bodies, and the public. The process of identifying stakeholders involves collecting information about their interests, expectations, roles, and influence on the project, using tools and techniques like stakeholder analysis, and expert judgments. The output of stakeholder identification is a stakeholder register and analysis, which serves as a basis for developing stakeholder engagement plans and communication strategies tailored to stakeholders' needs and characteristics. All right, so those are the high points of this particular process, the identify stakeholder process. All right, so with all this in place, you are now ready to plan your stakeholder engagements. Okay, so we're going to be discussing that in the next section. I'll see you there. Cheers.